Well, hey everybody, my name is Kent. I'm lead pastor here at Epic, and I want to welcome everybody over at Roxborough and Center City, Fairmount, everybody here at Parkside, everybody watching online. So glad that you are at church with us today. So glad you're with us because we are in the final part of this series that we've been in the last few weeks, all about fear. All about fear. And if you feel like you're coming in on the tail end of a movie at some point today, it's because in some ways you kind of are. This is the third part and final part of this series that we've been in, but that's okay because by tomorrow, all three parts of this series will be online for you to watch and catch up on any time that you want. Now, each week in this series, we've started off by talking about what fear is. And so here's how we've defined it. We said that fear is an emotion, it's something that we feel, and it's caused by the belief that someone or something will potentially cause us harm or loss. We've said that there's good fear and there's bad fear. Here's what we learned about good fear. Good or healthy fear actually protects us. It keeps us safe. We also learned that bad or unhealthy fear actually restricts us. It'll keep us from some things. It'll keep you from achieving things, keep you from experiencing things, keep you from doing some things. And ultimately, this kind of fear, this bad or unhealthy fear, it actually keeps you from having the life that God always dreamed for you to have. Last week, we talked about what fear shows up as in our life. Anybody remember what that is? Anxiety. There you go. I heard it. Front row. There you go. Anxiety, right? And there's a ton of research out there about anxiety right now, and that's because we as Americans are more anxious than we've ever been. In fact, a few facts that we talked about last week. One is this. Anxiety levels among Americans have increased year over year for the past 80 years. Every year, we've become more and more anxious. Here's another one. Anxiety disorders affect 1 in 5 Americans. That's at least 40 million people. 40 million people. And then there's this one. Millennials are the most anxious generation ever, like of all time. And so this is a problem. It's not going away. It's not getting better. In fact, it's getting worse. And that's why we decided to dedicate 3 whole weeks to talking about it. And I got to tell you, man, I'm so glad that we did, because the response and the feedback has been pretty tremendous. I've got a bunch of emails and some messages on Instagram, things like that, just saying, hey, this series has been super, super helpful. It just turns out that this is just one of those things that really hits home. You know what I'm saying? Just really hits home for a lot of us. And really, if you think about it, it makes sense that we would be somewhat anxious. I mean, in the times that we live in and with as much information as we have access to, you know what I'm saying? I told you last week how I stopped drinking sweet tea. I'm from the South, right? We drink sweet tea. That's as close as we'll ever get to drinking water. So I drink sweet tea. And I stopped drinking sweet tea because I didn't want to drink calories, so I started drinking Crystal Light. And for some reason, I had this little random thought, hey, I wonder if Crystal Light's good for you. So I Googled it, and I found out that they make Crystal Light straight from cancer. Straight from cancer. That's how they make Crystal Light. So I was like, oh man, I can't drink Crystal Light anymore. What was really cool was that on my way to Center City last week, someone stopped me and they said, hey, there is a version of Crystal Light that's available called Crystal Light Pure. It's Crystal Light without the cancer. And I was like, sweet, right? So I ordered it on Amazon. I got some this week, so now I'm drinking that. Here's why I say all that. Some of you know if Crystal Light Pure is good for me or not, and I don't want you to ruin this for me. Don't email me, don't tell me, don't wink at me right now. Don't let me know if it's good or bad. I don't want to mess this up, all right? So that's the thing. It's not just that. You watch TV, you watch the news, and you can find yourself getting pretty anxious pretty fast. I mean, think about this, guys. I kind of feel like if you watch the news, any news broadcast, and if you watch the first couple stories or the first few minutes of any news broadcast, and afterwards you're just kind of like, cool, something's wrong with you. You know what I'm saying? Like, if you're just like, it's like, cool, did you hear what they just said? Everything's on fire right now. Like, all the things are on fire. What do you mean cool? Things are not cool. In fact, things are the exact opposite of cool right now. And so if you're like me and you find yourself a little anxious from time to time, I don't think that that's without reason or without cause. In fact, I think that you're just observant. See, it bothers me whenever people say things like, the only thing there is to fear except fear itself. When I hear someone say that, I'm like, okay, well, have you had a chance to see some of fear's work lately? Do you know what I'm saying? It's like pretty devastating, right? Like kind of knocking out some solid gold hits one after another, this fear. It's no joke. It'll mess you up, Listen, fear and anxiety, these are real issues that deserve honest and thoughtful dialogue. Not just a bunch of cliche or trite or pat answers that essentially just leave you at the place where you're living life with your head in the sand, pretending like nothing bad is ever going to happen. Well, what we've discovered over the past few weeks in this series is that there's a lot of great information out there about how to manage the anxiety and fear in your life better. And those are all great things, and those are all good things and practices that we should all take part in. There's lots of tips and lots of tricks that are super helpful. But what we see from the scripture is that God actually offers us something so much better than just some tips and tricks about how to manage our fear and anxiety a little better. You see, what God offers us is peace. Like real peace. Like even if you're in the middle of a storm, God offers us peace. And I'm just saying, that's just better, isn't it? To be able to have peace. And so far in this series, we've actually looked at what the Apostle Paul taught and said about fear, which was this. He says, God's overwhelming love for you is what gives you the power to more than conquer overwhelming fear. God's overwhelming love for you is what gives you the power to more than conquer overwhelming fear. And then the next week, we looked at what Peter had to say about anxiety and fear. He said this, he says, you can continue to carry your fear and anxiety, or you can cast it on God. Like you can carry it, or you can cast it. That's your choice. And so with every anxious moment that we have, you and I have a decision to make. Am I going to keep this in my hands, or am I going to place this into mighty hands? Am I going to keep this in my hands, or am I going to place it into mighty hands? It's one or the other. It's my hands or mighty hands. I got an email this week from somebody who said that they've been saying this thing, my hands or mighty hands, to themselves all week long. Like with every situation, they're like, all right. My hands or mighty hands. It's one or the other. My hands or mighty hands. And I think that's great. That's great. But don't be that guy who like says that stuff out loud. You know what I'm saying? Because that's just weird. Like if you're walking around like, my hands, please don't be that guy. Do not be that guy. I'm just saying, it's not okay to be that guy. Because everybody else could be like, what are they saying all the time? I don't know. Something about how they have mighty hands. I don't know what that's about. Like what? I do not understand what's going on, So don't be weird. Don't be weird. And if you are going to be weird, hey, listen, just don't tell anybody that you go to church here, okay? That's the deal. I'm just saying, don't tell anybody at all, right? That's not okay, all right? I know some of you might be thinking, well, you got to stop saying like that because you're going to make people feel uncomfortable. Good. Now they know how it feels. Weird people have been making me feel uncomfortable for like ever, right? And so I think that's okay. Anyways, today we're going to talk about what Jesus actually taught his disciples to do with the fear and anxiety that was in their life. And so here it is. Listen, this is really deep, and so brace yourselves for this. Get ready. Here's what Jesus actually said about anxiety and fear. Quit it. Any questions? It's like, yeah, I got some questions. Like, what do you mean just, like, quit it? Like, what do you mean just quit it? I knew that you'd ask me that, and so I went ahead and looked it up, and here's what I found out. That essentially means, hey, stop doing that. That's what quit it means. Hey, would you stop doing that? And this is what Jesus taught his very first followers about fear and worry and anxiety. He's like, hey, just stop doing that, okay? Now, I don't know about you, but there's something about hearing that makes you go, no, that is not okay. In fact, that seems like the least helpful advice you could ever give to someone who's afraid or anxious. But I kid you not, over and over and over again, when the disciples were afraid, Jesus would always tell them some version of, hey, stop doing that. And at first glance, this doesn't even make sense if you think about it, right? I mean, it's like, just stop doing. If I could just stop doing that, I would, but I can't, so I don't. You know what I'm saying? And not only does it seem just incredibly impractical, but if you think about it, just stop doing that, quit it, that's borderline offensive. But somehow, this was like one of Jesus' favorite pieces of advice to give, because over and over again, he would tell his early followers, just stop being afraid. Just stop. And I want to show you this morning a few of the moments where he gave this advice and shared this with the people that were following him. And my hope is that by looking at these different times that this happened, my hope is that we can begin to try and get down to the bottom of why in the world Jesus would give this kind of advice when it comes to fear and anxiety and worry. Here we go, Matthew chapter 10. Jesus gets the 12 apostles together, and he says to them, basically says this, look, we've been together for some time now, and so here's what we're going to do going forward. We're going to split up into teams of 2, and I'm going to send you guys out to start doing some things. And I want you to look at what he says about this in Matthew chapter 10, starting in verse number 16. He says, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. It's like, wait, what? I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. Jesus is like, hey, listen, yeah, I'm sending you out like sheep among, like you're the sheep, and all of them, they're the wolves. You're the sheep, they're the wolves. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm one of the disciples, I'm like, excuse me, about these wolves. Like these some like little baby wolves or something? No, they're not little baby wolves? Well, I don't really know if this is an activity that I'd like to participate in, Jesus. So, because I know about these wolves. I heard about them. They huff, they puff, they blow your whole house down. You know what I'm saying? And so I would like not to be part of that. So you go ahead, go on. I'm going to stay right here where there are no wolves with teeth. You know what I'm saying? Well, Jesus goes on, and I'm just paraphrasing what he basically says in this passage, but he says, hey, you're going to go out 2 by 2, and as you do, some of you are going to get arrested, some of you are going to be beaten, some of you are going to be hated by just about everyone, some of you are going to go to prison, and then he says, and when that happens, like not if that happens, but when that happens, he says, hey, just try to escape, okay? In fact, he goes on, he says, in fact, you're all going to have to sacrifice a pretty great deal in order to follow me. And then he says this on the heels of all that, verse 31, so don't be afraid. And I'm like, too late. It's too late. I'm already afraid. I'm already scared. You can't say all that and then follow it up with, so don't be afraid. Too late. I'm already afraid. Like, what are you talking about? Don't be afraid. And then he gives them a reason why they could not be afraid. Here's what he says. He says, so don't be afraid because you are worth more than many sparrows. In other words, Jesus says, hey, you don't have to be afraid because you're valuable to God. I mean, think about this. When something is of value to you, what do you do with it? You take care of it. He said, listen, you don't have to be afraid because you're valuable to me. And I'm going to take care of you. Does that mean that all those bad things that he just said aren't going to happen to them? No, all the bad things happen. All those bad things happen to them. It still happens. But what he is saying is that you don't have to live your life in fear of those things, because regardless of what may or may not happen, it's going to be okay, because his promise to us is that he's going to take care of us. So don't be afraid. Listen, if you knew just how valuable you are to God, your confidence in his promise to care for you wouldn't be so cheap. If you knew just how valuable you are to God, your confidence in his promise to you to take care of you would not be so cheap. I heard a story about 2 business guys that were stranded on a desert island. And when they got washed up to shore, one guy gets up and he's freaking out. He's like, we are gonna die. There's no food, there's no water, we have no way of communicating to anybody, we're gonna die. The other guy is completely calm. The first guy is like, hey, I don't think you understand what's going on here. I don't think you understand the gravity of the situation. We're gonna die. And the second guy goes, no, you don't understand. I make millions of dollars a year. The first guy says, who cares how much money you make? We don't have food and water. We're all going to die. The second guy says, no, you don't understand. I make millions of dollars a year, and I give 10% of it to my church. My pastor is going to find us. Now listen, I got to tell you, I hate pastor jokes, but that one's kind of true. I'm just saying, because I'd be a searching fool. I'd be like, where they at? Get me a bass boat and go across the Atlantic. I'd be like, I'm a-coming. I'm going to find you. Got to pay for some stuff around here. Listen, you don't have to be afraid because you're valuable to God. And his promise is that he's going to take care of you. Here's another time where Jesus said to his followers to not be afraid. Matthew chapter 8. Sometimes when Jesus was teaching, he would teach to crowds that would grow to thousands. And the only way for him to ever get away from the crowd was to get on a boat and travel to some other place. They didn't have like a fleet of, black SUVs to just kind of swoop them off at any moment. So in Matthew chapter 8, Jesus is kind of done with all the crowds, and then he decides it's time to leave. And so verse 23 is where we pick up the story. It says, then he got into the boat, and his disciples followed him. Suddenly, a furious storm came upon the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. All right, so this is not a good situation, right? Like, I don't know if you've ever been on a boat that you felt was going down, or I don't know if you've ever been on a plane that you thought maybe this isn't looking so good. Maybe you hit some turbulence or something like that. But this is that moment. Like, the waves are crashing over the boat. They're taking on water on the boat. The boat is beginning to sink. But I want you to look at what Jesus is doing. Verse 24. But Jesus was asleep. Jesus was sleeping. Now get this. They're sinking. Jesus is sleeping. They're sinking. Jesus is sleeping. Now this is important because some of you actually walked away from faith and walked away from a relationship with God because you went through a difficult time in your life at some point. And when you went through that difficult time, you prayed, but it felt like Jesus was sleeping. And God didn't do what you thought he should or could or would. And that led you to believe one or two things. That one, he just doesn't care. Or two, God just must not exist. And so because of that, you just walked away from faith in God altogether. Man, if that's you, I want you to consider coming back to a relationship with God, and here's why. You're not the only one to have ever felt that way. The people who knew Jesus best felt that way. The people that Jesus loved the most experienced that exact same thing. Here they are sinking, and they didn't just think that God might be sleeping. They saw him sleeping while they're sinking. So often we think that if we become a follower of Jesus, then everything's just going to be smooth sailing from that point on in our life, but that's just not true. Listen, Jesus never promised that there wouldn't be any storms that you would walk through or go through. And Jesus never promised that those storms wouldn't rock you. His promise to you was that those storms wouldn't sink you. In fact, I want you to see what happens here. Verse 25, it says, the disciples went and they woke him saying, Lord, save us. We're going to drown. He replied, you have little faith. And then look at the question he asked them. Why are you so afraid? And I'm sure at least one of them had to have thought to themselves, didn't you read verse 24? Like, didn't you? There's a furious storm and the waves are sweeping over the boat. Can't you see what's happening right now? What do you mean, why am I so afraid? Isn't it obvious why we're all so afraid? We're all about to die, Jesus. Come on, man. And then look what happens. It says, then he got up, talking about Jesus, and he rebuked the winds and the waves. I don't know exactly how that went. It was like bad waves, bad wind. And it was completely calm. What? Isn't that just like the most boss move ever? Jesus rolls out the bed, still got sleep in his eye, kind of yawning. He's like, oh, wind, waves, stop it. And then they do. Like the winds and the waves, they just stop. All of a sudden, we see that things go from total chaos to complete peace. See, I think that this was just God's way of showing them that you don't have to be afraid. Why? Because there's no storm that he can't calm. There is no storm that he can't calm. And for some of you, that's exactly what you need to hear right now. Like you just need to hear me say to you that there is no storm. Not even that one. That God can't calm. You don't have to be afraid because there's no storm that God can't calm. Now, apparently, those that were following Jesus, they still hadn't gotten it yet. They still hadn't picked up what Jesus was laying down. And so I want you to see what happens just a few chapters later over in Matthew chapter 14. Again, thousands of people have gathered to hear Jesus. And then he decides again, hey, it's time for us to leave. Verse 22 of Matthew 14 says, immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat. You know why Jesus had to make the disciples get in the boat? Yeah, because last time they almost died. They're like, we're not doing this again. Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. And so what's different about this time is that he sends them off by themselves and says, I'm going to stay back and dismiss the crowd and I'll catch up. And they knew better than to ask any questions. Like, it's like, what, you got an extra boat? Like, what? How you going to do that, Jesus? Okay, well, never mind. Just see you there, you know? So they don't ask any questions. And Jesus says, hey, you go on, and I'm going to dismiss the crowd, all right? So verse 23. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. And so they're out in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, and they're struggling to get to the other side because the wind, they're rowing into a headwind, right? They're basically in one, this is the first rowing machine, all right? They're in one spot. They hadn't moved much, right? And this time it's not because there's a storm. This time it's because of this headwind that's against them. And then the scripture says, verse 25, it says, and shortly before dawn, which tells us that they had been there all night long fighting this wind and not getting very far. It says, shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were what? Terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid. Can you imagine how Jesus must have been feeling in this moment? Like he had to be thinking, man, like, are you serious? You're scared again? Like, don't you get it? I'm trying to teach you something about fear here. Like, remember that whole sheep among wolves thing? Remember what I said? You don't have to be afraid because you're valuable to me. I'm going to take care of you. Remember that whole big storm we had the other day out here on the water? Remember what you learned from that? That you don't have to be afraid because there is no storm that I can't calm. And now here you are, you're freaking out all over again. Like, haven't you learned what I'm trying to teach you through all of this? Like, how many times do I have to almost kill you to get you to understand that you don't have to be afraid, even when there's something to be afraid of? That you do not have to be afraid, even when there's something to be afraid of. He's saying, I'm not saying that there's nothing to be afraid of. I'm not saying that there's not a storm, but I am saying that you don't have to be afraid even when there's something to be afraid of. And here's why. Because of me. See, if there wasn't a me, then I'd understand why you'd be afraid. And if there wasn't a me, then I'd understand why you'd be scared. If there wasn't a me, then I'd understand why you'd be anxious. And if there wasn't a me, then I'd understand why you'd be so worried. But there's a me. I'm here for you. I care for you. Don't you realize who I am? You see, the thing that changes everything is this: I'm with you through every storm and every doubt and every struggle. God's promise is I'm with you. It's like he says, see, if I'm with you, then you don't have to be afraid even if there's something to be afraid of. If I'm for you, then you don't have to be afraid of whatever it is that's against you. If I'm in your corner, then you don't have to be afraid of whatever it is that you're facing that's standing across the ring from you. So what is it that's got you so shook? Is it failing? Is it the uncertainty of the future? Is it a financial thing? Is it a relationship thing? Is it getting older and being alone? Is it not being as far along as you hope to by now? Is it a health thing? Is it cancer? It doesn't matter what it is. You don't have to be afraid, even if there's something to be afraid of, because I'm with you. Now, this idea that you don't have to be afraid because God is with you is a major theme that we see all throughout the scripture. In fact, about 150 times God says, fear not. In other words, he says, don't be afraid. Literally, since the beginning of time, God has been saying, don't be afraid. To leader after leader after leader and follower after follower after follower, God has been saying, don't be afraid. Now, if I just got up this morning and I just told you, hey, fear not, half of you would be like, yeah, because there's something wrong with you. The other half of you would be like, he's yelling, I'm leaving. Like, what is that about? Like, I got to get out of here. Like, what? Right, and that's because your little fight or flight thing is almost always set on flight. You know what I'm saying? So I can't handle this, right? Others of you would be just like, I hope he doesn't yell again, because you went from, you weren't fight, flight, you're just fright. You're just scared, right? If God only ever said, fear not, that would have never been enough. But if you look at the scriptures, almost every single time, without fail, every single time God says, fear not, he also says, I am with you. You see, this isn't a command as much as it's an invitation. And so it's not about you facing your fear as much as it's about how things can be different when God is near. It's not about you facing your fear as much as it is about how things can be different when God is near. I heard a story about a little boy who went for a walk with his dad in the woods. His dad decided to play a little trick on him. They're going to get lost. He wanted to see how he'd handle it. So they're walking and walking and walking. They get to the point where the dad's just like, I have no clue where we are. And he looks down at the kid and he goes, hey, son, you know where we are? Kid's like, nope. He says, well, aren't you scared? Kid's like, nope. Why aren't you scared? We don't know how to get home. He says, I'm with you. There's just something about being with that makes fear take flight. You know what I'm saying? And your Heavenly Father says, I'm with you. So what are you scared of? What are you afraid of? And one of the things I love about being a dad is I love how my kids act when they're just around me and my wife. It's different. When they're just around us, like they are just completely free. Like they are, like when they're around us, we see all like the most beautiful, colorful parts of their personality. It's like, boom, it's like, look at this thing. But then we get around other people and they just kind of clam up. What's the difference? When they're with me, there's no fear. And somehow, just being with frees them up to be a better version even of themselves. I think it's the same with our Heavenly Father. You know? Just being with does something. You know, if you think about it, you can almost do just about anything if you have the right person with you, right? I'm not very good at math, and so every time I need to do math, or we need to figure out square footage or something, I bring along my friend Jake. Jake, pastor at Roxborough, he rocks math, kills it. He's awesome. I'm not intimidated at all whenever we have to do math if Jake is there. Changes everything, right? Because he's with, right? I don't know anything about houses, nothing. But when we were looking for a house, I brought my friend Nate. Right? He's a contractor, does a bunch of work. He was able to look at the house and be like, this is a good house. I wasn't intimidated at all. I was like, we're going to get that house. Right? Why? Because he was with. You know the thing about life? It can be pretty intimidating. Unless you're with. Because I'm telling you, there is no better person to be with than Jesus when it comes to how you do your life. In fact, we say it like this around here, that Jesus doesn't just make your life better, but he makes you better at life. And that's something that we want for everybody. You see, the truth is that some of you are in a storm, and you're not in the storm with Jesus. You're in the storm on your own. And I believe that God doesn't want you to spend one more day trying to get through it alone. And I'm not saying that God caused the storm, but I am saying that sometimes God will allow a storm to get you to the place where you have no other option except to look up and call on him. God does that because sometimes when there's no storm, we don't really feel the deep need that we have for God. The truth is that whether you're in a storm or not, you do need God. We all need God. We all desperately need Jesus to be the forgiver of our sin and the leader of our life. And I'm telling you, the moment that you step across the line is the moment that God says, hey, okay, now I'm with you. Wherever you go, whatever you do, I am with you. You don't ever have to face another storm alone again. And one day, you'll be able to stand before God and heaven so glad that you took the step to cross the line of faith, make him the forgiver of your sin, the leader of your life, and you decide to follow him. That'd be a good day. So here's how I want to end our time today. Even if this really isn't your thing right now. Everybody just take a moment, if you would. You bow your heads, close your eyes. And I just want you to take a second. I want you to think about the thing that you fear most. For some of you, it's losing a loved one. For others of you, it's losing someone else that you love. For some, it's a financial thing. For some, it's a marriage thing. For others, it's a health thing. What is it? What is it that you fear most? What is it for you that's your storm? What is it for you that's the thing where the waves are crashing over the bow? That's the thing that makes you wonder if Jesus is asleep. That's the thing that makes you wonder if anybody cares. What is it that you fear most? What's your thing? I just want to say to you, on behalf of your Heavenly Father, don't be afraid. You don't have to be afraid, even if you have a reason to be afraid, because I am with you. Some of you look at your situation and you're like, God must be asleep. You look at your career or your relational status or your hopes and dreams. Think about your family, your children. To be honest, you're afraid. Others of you, you're just tired. You feel like you've been rowing through the night and you're in the fight of your life. And just when you thought you couldn't go on one more step, here comes another round of bad news. And because of that, you're afraid. Here's what I want you to know. He can calm that storm. He can split that sea. He's faithful. He's able. He's good. He's with you. He's for you. He'll never leave you or forsake you. And you can trust that he'll lead you through. You know the thing about fear that's so bad? It controls you. It drives your decisions. It dominates your thoughts. It drains you of anything good. But here's what I know. Fear makes a horrible master. But with Jesus, you can master your fear. Listen to this promise from Isaiah 41:10. So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. God bless you guys.